Alexander Hamilton was a man of contradictions, and perhaps that is why his story continues to capture the imagination centuries after his death. Among the founding fathers of the United States, he remains one of the least understood, and yet his influence runs deeper than most. He was not born into wealth, privilege, or even legitimacy. Instead, his life began on a small Caribbean island, in the shadows of hardship, abandonment, and loss. By all accounts, the world expected very little from him, and yet Hamilton defied every expectation. He rose from an orphaned boy, with no name and no fortune, to become the principal architect of America's financial system. It was Hamilton who laid the foundation of the Treasury, who envisioned a national bank, who saw beyond the struggles of a fragile republic and imagined a powerful, modern nation. His pen and his intellect were as mighty as any musket, shaping both the Constitution and the very identity of the country. But Hamilton's life was not a straight climb to glory. It was a journey marked by brilliance and by scandal, by ambition that earned him both admirers and bitter enemies. And in the end it was pride, politics, and a duel of honor that brought his story to a bloody conclusion on the banks of the Hudson River in 1804. The tale of Alexander Hamilton is at once tragic and inspiring. The immigrant who rose from obscurity, the thinker who became a warrior, the statesman who helped forge a nation, and the man whose restless spirit still echoes in the heart of America. This is not only the story of Hamilton himself, but the story of a new republic, born from revolution, and built on the vision of those bold enough to dream beyond their time. Childhood of hardship. Alexander Hamilton's beginnings could hardly have been more difficult. He entered the world on the small Caribbean island of Nevis, sometime in the mid-18th century. Even the year of his birth remains uncertain, with some records suggesting 1755 and others 1757. From the start, Hamilton carried the burden of illegitimacy. His mother, Rachel Fozette, came from a family of French Huguenot descent, while his father, James Hamilton, was a Scottish trader, yet the two never married. In the rigid society of the time, that fact branded young Alexander as an outsider, one who would forever be denied the privileges of status and inheritance. His father eventually abandoned the family, leaving Rachel to raise Alexander and his brother alone. Then, when Hamilton was still only a boy, tragedy struck again. His mother died suddenly of fever, leaving him an orphan at the age of 13. Homeless, impoverished, and burdened with grief, the boy who would one day help design a nation had nothing but his mind to rely upon. And yet it was in this crucible of hardship that Hamilton's extraordinary gifts began to shine. He devoured books, teaching himself history, mathematics, and literature. He found work as a clerk at a trading company, where he mastered the details of global commerce, learning about shipping routes, currencies, and the mechanics of trade that stretched across oceans. At an age when most boys were still in school, Hamilton was already shaping the mind of a future statesman. The odds were stacked cruelly against him, but adversity became the forge of his ambition. Each setback deepened his hunger to rise, to prove that birth and circumstance would not define his destiny. In the face of loss, Hamilton began the climb from obscurity that would eventually take him all the way to the heart of the American Revolution. A gifted mind emerges. As Alexander Hamilton grew into adolescence, it became clear that he was no ordinary boy. Though orphaned and poor, he possessed a mind of rare brilliance, restless, curious, and hungry for knowledge. By his teenage years, he had secured work as a clerk at Beekman and Kruger, a trading company on the island of St. Croix, in the Danish West Indies. For most youths, clerical work was dull routine, but for Hamilton, it was a classroom unlike any other. Day after day, he managed cargo ledgers, calculated exchange rates, and oversaw transactions that connected the Caribbean to the great ports of Europe and North America. He learned how sugar, rum, and molasses flowed outward, while manufactured goods and currency flowed in. He mastered the mathematics of commerce and the language of finance, absorbing the rhythms of global trade in a way that few men twice his age could have done. At the same time, Hamilton nurtured his gift for language. He read voraciously texts, histories, and essays, teaching himself to think critically and to write with power. His pen soon became as sharp as his mind. In 1772, when a hurricane of devastating force tore through St. Croix, young Hamilton wrote a striking account of the disaster. His essay, published in a local newspaper, revealed not only vivid description but also the vision of a thinker far beyond his years. He wrote of destruction, faith, and resilience, as though channeling both poetry and prophecy. The island's leading citizens were astonished. How could such insight, such eloquence, come from a boy so young and so poor? Moved by his talent, they raised money to send Hamilton to the American colonies, where he might find the education and opportunity that his brilliance deserved. It was a turning point, a moment when the winds of tragedy propelled him toward destiny. The storm that shattered his island would, in its aftermath, launch Hamilton on the journey that would forever alter the course of his life, and ultimately, the course of a nation. Journey to the New World. In 1773, with the support of benefactors, who recognized his genius, Alexander Hamilton left the Caribbean behind. The young man, barely 16 years old, boarded a ship bound for mainland North America. It was more than a journey across the ocean. It was a passage from obscurity to opportunity, from survival to possibility. For the orphan from Nevis, the New World represented not just a destination, but a chance to remake his destiny. Arriving in New York, Hamilton entered King's College, known today as Columbia University. Here, his restless mind found fertile ground. He devoured his studies with the same hunger that had carried him through hardship. Mathematics, economics, law, philosophy, anything escaped his curiosity. But Hamilton was not content to remain a silent student. He quickly became an active participant in the fiery debates that swept the colonies in the years leading up to Revolution. The 1770s were years of rising tension. Parliament's taxes, the presence of British troops, and the cries for liberty filled every tavern and every newspaper. Hamilton threw himself into the fray, publishing pamphlets and essays that were bold, articulate, and astonishingly mature. In prose both elegant and forceful, he challenged the authority of the crown and defended the rights of the colonies. His words revealed a mind that could marry logic with passion, argument with conviction. These writings drew attention from prominent patriots, who marveled that such arguments came from someone so young and so newly arrived from a distant island. Already, Hamilton was stepping out of anonymity, transforming from an immigrant student into a voice of the American cause. He had crossed the sea to find education. But what he truly discovered was a new identity. Alexander Hamilton, not simply a scholar, but a revolutionary in the making, *a soldier in revolution. By the mid-1770s, the colonies were in open defiance of Britain. Protests had escalated into skirmishes, and the call for independence grew louder with every passing month. Alexander Hamilton, still a young student, could not stand by as history unfolded around him. He exchanged the pen for the musket and joined the New York militia, determined to fight not only with words but also with action. From the beginning, Hamilton displayed a rare combination of discipline and brilliance. Appointed as captain of an artillery company, he quickly won the respect of both his men and his superiors. At the battles of Trenton and Princeton, his cannons roared across frozen fields, turning the tide in moments of desperate struggle. In those chaotic hours, the young immigrant proved that courage and intellect could command as much as birth or wealth. It was not long before Hamilton caught the attention of General George Washington himself. The commander-in-chief saw in him more than just a skilled artillery officer. He saw a mind capable of strategy, of organization, of vision. Washington invited Hamilton to serve as his aide-de-camp, a role that would bring the young captain into the very heart of the revolution. As Washington's secretary and confidant, Hamilton drafted letters, shaped policy, and managed the lifeblood of communication that held the Continental Army together. But he was more than a clerk. He was a strategist, a thinker, and at times, the very voice of Washington's command. For Hamilton, the revolution was more than a war for independence. It was a crucible where his talents could rise, where his loyalty to a new idea, the birth of a nation, could be tested and proven. In the smoke of battle and the silence of candlelit tents, Alexander Hamilton was becoming not just a soldier, but a statesman in the making. From soldier to statesman. When the Revolutionary War drew to a close, Alexander Hamilton stood at a crossroads. He had proven himself in battle and in service to General George Washington. Yet he was still a young man with no fortune and no established position in society. But fate once again opened a door. In 1780, Hamilton married Elizabeth Schuyler, the daughter of Philip Schuyler, a wealthy landowner and one of New York's most influential political figures. This marriage brought Hamilton not only a lifelong partner, but also powerful connections that would anchor him within America's political elite. As the muskets fell silent, the true battle began, the struggle to shape a new nation from the ashes of revolution. The Articles of Confederation had left the United States weak, divided, and adrift. Hamilton saw clearly that if America were to survive, it needed a stronger central government, a structure that could command respect abroad and stability at home. To persuade a skeptical public, Hamilton joined forces with James Madison and John Jay to write what became known as the Federalist Papers. In a breathtaking display of intellectual stamina, Hamilton authored 51 of the 85 essays himself. These writings explained, defended, and promoted the new Constitution with unmatched clarity and force. They argued for unity, for energy in government, and for a balance between liberty and order. The Federalist Papers remain to this day one of the most important collections of political philosophy in the world. Through them, Hamilton not only defended the birth of the Constitution but also etched his vision into the very foundation of American democracy. The war had made Hamilton a soldier. The debates that followed transformed him into a statesman, one whose voice would resonate long after the ink of the Constitution dried. First Secretary of the Treasury. In 1789, as George Washington took the oath of office to become the first president of the United States, he looked to trusted figures who could give shape and strength to the fragile republic. For the critical role of Secretary of the Treasury, Washington chose Alexander Hamilton. It was a bold decision, for Hamilton was still young and controversial. Yet Washington recognized in him a vision and an energy that few others possessed. The challenges Hamilton faced were immense. The new nation was drowning in debt, the states owed millions from the war, the federal government had no reliable revenue, and foreign creditors doubted America's ability to pay. Without financial stability, the republic risked collapsing before it could truly stand. Hamilton set to work with relentless determination. He proposed that the federal government assume the debts of the states, binding them together under a common financial responsibility. He argued for the establishment of a national bank, modeled on European central banks, to issue currency and regulate credit. He designed systems of tariffs and excise taxes to provide revenue, and he encouraged the development of industry, believing that America's future should not rest solely on farming, but also on manufacturing and commerce. These proposals electrified the young nation. To Hamilton's supporters, they were the blueprint of a modern, powerful America. To his opponents, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, they were dangerous steps toward monarchy and centralized tyranny. Out of this clash was born the first great political divide in the United States: the Federalists, who rallied to Hamilton's vision, and the Democratic Republicans, who followed Jefferson, Issaguirre, and Ideal through fiery debates, pamphlets, and bitter rivalries. Hamilton reshaped America's destiny. He transformed a bankrupt confederation into a nation with credit, stability, and ambition. As the first Secretary of the Treasury, he built not just policies, but the very framework of the American economy. Framework that endures to this day. **** Triumph and scandal. Even as Alexander Hamilton stood at the height of his influence, his ambition and brilliance were shadowed by personal weaknesses. By the early 1790s, he had helped stabilize the nation's finances, established America's credit abroad, and secured his place as one of the most powerful men in Washington's administration. Yet it was not political opposition that first struck at his reputation, it was scandal, born from choices that revealed his all-too-human flaws. In 1791, while still serving as Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton became entangled in an affair with Maria Reynolds, the wife of a scheming opportunist named James Reynolds. What began as a private failing quickly turned into a trap. James Reynolds discovered the liaison and demanded payment to keep it quiet. Hamilton, fearful of disgrace, agreed. For months, he paid hush money, a secret that festered beneath his otherwise shining career. Years later, his enemies uncovered hints of the affair and accused him of financial corruption. He had used public funds to enrich himself. Facing ruin, Hamilton made a desperate choice. In 1797, he published what became known as the Reynolds pamphlet, a long and painful confession in which he admitted to adultery but denied any misuse of government money. By laying bare the details of his infidelity, he preserved his political honesty but destroyed his personal honor. The scandal shocked the young republic. For many, Hamilton's image as a moral statesman was forever tarnished. Yet, through it all, one figure remained by his side: his wife, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. Eliza endured humiliation and heartbreak, but her loyalty never wavered. She would outlive him by half a century, dedicating her life to protecting and preserving the legacy of the man who had both betrayed and loved her. Thus, even at the height of triumph, Hamilton's story revealed the fragility of human ambition. He was a man of towering intellect, undone not by foreign armies or political foes, but by his own restless heart. **** The fatal duel with Aaron Burr. By the dawn of the 19th century, Alexander Hamilton's influence had begun to wane, yet his voice remained powerful and his pen still sharp. His fiery nature, his relentless ambition, and his unwillingness to compromise had made him enemies throughout his career. None, however, grew into a rival as bitter as Aaron Burr. Burr, a seasoned politician and the sitting vice president of the United States, was as ambitious as Hamilton but far more enigmatic. Where Hamilton was outspoken and direct, Burr was cautious, calculating, and elusive. The two men had crossed paths in politics for decades, rivals at the bar, opponents in New York's elections, and combatants in the bitterly divided world of Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Each saw the other not merely as an adversary, but as a threat to the future of the nation itself. In 1804, tensions finally reached their breaking point. After Hamilton publicly criticized Burr during his campaign for governor of New York, Burr demanded satisfaction. In the code of honor that still ruled gentlemen of the age, there was only one way to resolve such an insult: a duel. On the morning of July 11, 1804, the two men met on the bluffs of Weehawken, New Jersey. The air was heavy with silence as they prepared their pistols. Hamilton, who had spoken privately of his moral opposition to dueling, seemed torn between principle and pride. When the shots rang out, it was Burr's bullet that struck true. Hamilton fell, mortally wounded, and was carried back to New York. The next day, surrounded by family and friends, he breathed his last. He was not yet 50 years old. The duel shocked the young republic. A nation that Hamilton had helped design now mourned the loss of its most brilliant, if controversial, found his death was not only the end of a man but the closing of a chapter in America's turbulent birth. ***, a lasting legacy. Though Alexander Hamilton's life ended in tragedy, his vision did not perish with him. In the decades that followed, the systems he designed became the very backbone of the United States. His financial programs gave the nation stability when collapse seemed inevitable. His insistence on public credit allowed America to borrow, trade, and stand on equal footing with the great powers of Europe. His belief in a strong central government, though controversial in his time, gave the young republic the structure it needed to endure. But Hamilton's legacy was not only written in ledgers and laws, it was carried forward by the family he left behind, most of all by his wife, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. Widowed at just 47 years old, Eliza devoted the remaining 50 years of her life to protecting her husband's memory. She preserved his writings, defended his reputation, and ensured that the world would not forget his contributions. She also became a force of compassion in her own right, founding orphanages and schools, extending the generosity to others that Hamilton himself had so rarely known in childhood. In the centuries that followed, Hamilton's name would rise and fall with the tides of history. At times, he was remembered only as the man who fell in a duel. At other times, scholars and leaders rediscovered his genius, seeing in his vision the roots of America's rise as a global power. Abraham Lincoln admired his defense of the Constitution. Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt echoed his belief in energetic government. And in our own time, his story found new life on the stage. Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical Hamilton transformed the immigrant founder into a global icon, reminding the world that the boy from Nevis, illegitimate, orphaned, and poor had helped build a nation. Alexander Hamilton's life was short, but his ideas remain eternal. His legacy endures in every dollar that circulates, in every institution that governs, and in every dream that tells us no origin is too humble, no beginning too small, to shape the destiny of history itself.